The chain snapped at 7:42 in the morning. Not broke, snapped. A 7/8-inch grade 70 tow chain rated to 26,400 pounds of working load, and it let go like a rifle shot. The two ends flew in opposite directions, and one of them took out the rear window of my pickup truck parked 60 yards away. Nobody got hurt. That was the only good news for the next several hours. I want to start there because that's where the real story starts. Not when the tractor went in. That part took about 45 seconds. The getting out part took 11 hours, 3 additional tractors, a borrowed recovery winch from a pipeline contractor 2 counties away, and more chain than I care to think about. But the chain snapping at 7:42 was the moment I understood we were not dealing with a normal stuck situation. We were dealing with something that had its own opinion about whether that machine was coming out at all. My name is Wade Holcomb. I've been farming outside of Sikeston, Missouri for 29 years. Southeast Missouri Bottomland, the kind of ground that was underwater for most of human history, and only got farmed because a generation of men with drag lines and determination decided to drain it in the 1920s and 30s. It's some of the most productive ground in the country when it's right. When it's wrong, it's something else entirely. It becomes a material that acts like solid earth from the surface and liquid from 6 inches down. Engineers have a word for it. I have different words, none of them printable. The specific character of this ground matters to the story. Southeast Missouri Bottomland is alluvial, built by the Mississippi and its tributaries, depositing silt and clay over millennia, until the drainage projects of the early 20th century changed everything. What that process left behind is extraordinarily fertile soil that has the physical properties of a wet sponge at depth. Clay content in some of our fields runs 55 to 65% below the plow zone. When that clay is at the right moisture, it flows around a heavy object like water around a stone, then closes back, sealing it in with suction force that is genuinely difficult to overstate. I have had boots pulled off my feet walking this ground in a wet spring. What it does to a 67,000-pound tracked machine is something on a different scale entirely. The machine that went in was my Challenger MT975E. For those who don't know that tractor, and if you don't, pay attention, because it matters to understand what we were dealing with. The MT975E is a rubber-tracked row crop tractor running a Caterpillar C18 diesel engine. That engine displaces 18 liters. It produces 1,050 horsepower at the PTO and somewhere around 3,100 pound-feet of torque at peak pull. The machine weighs 62,000 pounds empty. With the front weights I had on it and a full fuel load, we were probably sitting at 67,000 pounds when it went in. That's 33.5 tons. In mud, we had received 2 inches of rain in the 5 days prior. Not all at once. That would have been easier to account for. It came in waves, 2 inches one night, 1.5 inches the next afternoon, and then another 3+ over a single 12-hour period on the Wednesday before this happened. The field I was trying to work was a 280-acre block of river bottom ground that had been tiled in the 1970s. Decent tile, still functional, but designed for the rain events of that era. What we'd gotten that week was not a 1970s rain event. The tile was overwhelmed. The water table had come up to within 18 inches of the surface, and in the low corner of that field, the northeast corner, where the old meander scar from the original river channel crossed, the ground was not what it appeared to be from the surface. I was running the Challenger, pulling a 24-row DMI vertical tillage unit, doing a pass to work down the corn stalks from last fall's harvest, trying to get ahead of planting. The forecast showed a 7-day window of dry weather starting the following Monday, and I wanted to have the field ready. That was the plan. The field had other ideas. The pass went fine for the first 200 acres. I was monitoring soil conditions from the cab, watching the depth sensor, watching the load on the machine. Everything was reading within tolerance. Then I crossed into the northeast corner and the front of the machine dropped. Not dramatically. About 4 inches, which in a 62,000-pound tracked machine is barely perceptible from the cab. Just a slight nose down, a slight increase in load on the engine. I let off the tillage depth. I should have stopped right then. Instead, I gave it a little more throttle, thinking I'd power through the soft zone, which is the exact wrong thing to do in bottomland mud, and I knew it, and I did it anyway. That's the honest accounting of what happened. The front went down another 6 inches. The tracks started spinning on a layer of mud that had no bottom the machine could push against. In a rubber-tracked tractor, when you lose traction, you lose everything at once. There's no differential, no way to transfer power to a wheel that's still gripping, because all 4 tracks are already committed to the same surface. The nose went down 8 inches, 10. The front frame hit the mud surface. The engine, bless it, kept running. The tracks kept turning. The machine kept sinking. By the time I killed the engine and opened the cab door and looked down, the rear tracks were buried to the top of the track frame, and the front of the machine was in mud to the bottom of the engine housing. I sat there and took a personal inventory of every decision that had led to this moment. Then I called my neighbor, Greg Phipps. But before I dialed, I did something I've done on bad days before. I sat in the cab for about 3 minutes and just looked at what I had in front of me. The mud was dark, almost black. That particular southeast Missouri black, that means organic matter and drainage history, all compressed into a layer that has no structural integrity once you've broken through the crust. The front track frames were completely submerged. The rear tracks were visible only at the top edge, the rubber pads still turning slowly by reflex from where I'd killed the throttle at speed. The tillage unit behind the machine had settled too, though less dramatically. It was on firmer ground back where the meander scar thinned out. I could see my own tractor's exhaust stack from the side window, and it looked wrong. Lower than it should be, angled slightly forward, the way a ship looks when the bow is taking water. I keyed up the radio and told my wife Karen what had happened. She said 3 words. "Do you need me?" I said. "Get Greg first," she said, already calling. If you've ever buried a machine so deep you genuinely didn't know if it was coming out, subscribe right now. Because what we did over the next 11 hours was not standard operating procedure for anything. It was improvised recovery at a scale most people never see, and every single step of it taught me something I'll carry for the rest of my farming life. Greg got there in 40 minutes with his John Deere 9620 RX. That's a 620 horsepower, 4-track machine, 49,000 pounds. He took one look at my Challenger sitting in that northeast corner with mud up to its belly and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Wade, I've seen stuck. This is past stuck. This is committed." I said, "I know." He said, "Who else are we calling?" I said, "Everybody." We called Dale Stubblefield, who runs a 560 horsepower Case IH Steiger quad track about 4 miles east. We called my brother-in-law Ken, who has a John Deere 8400, older machine, 225 horsepower, not a hero but willing. And we called a pipeline maintenance contractor named Buster Hines, who I knew had a truck-mounted hydraulic recovery winch that he used for pulling pipe out of trenches. Buster's winch was rated to 80,000 pounds of single-line pull. We were going to need it. The strategy we settled on after walking the situation was this. We could not simply hook to the Challenger and pull. The mud had too much grip on the underside of the machine. Suction, essentially, created by the frame sitting flat on the substrate, with thousands of pounds pressing it down. If you just pull, you don't break the tractor loose from the mud, you just elongate it. The first thing we needed to do was get some air under the front of the machine to break the suction seal. Dale brought his quad track with a 12-foot hydraulic blade mounted on the front. He uses it for land leveling. We spent the first 90 minutes using that blade to work the mud away from the front corners of the Challenger, digging down alongside the tracks on both sides, trying to create channels where water and air could get under the frame. This is delicate work with a 560 horsepower machine when what you're digging around is a $450,000 piece of equipment. Dale is good. He worked those channels 4 feet down on each side without touching the Challenger once. That's when we put the chain on for the first try. Greg's 9620RX on the front, single chain, 7 8-inch grade 70. Greg gave it a steady pull. The chain came tight. The Challenger groaned. You could hear it, a deep settling sound as the suction resisted. The chain was at maybe 20,000 pounds of tension when it let go. That was the rifle shot. That was 7:42 a.m. Nobody panicked. You can't panic in a situation like this because panic makes you do the next wrong thing faster. We stood in the mud and talked it through. The problem was clear. We were pulling on one point, which meant the force was uneven, and the suction on the underside was stronger than a single chain direct pull could break. We needed to either pull from multiple points simultaneously, or we needed to change the angle of pull to work the machine out of the mud the way you work a boot out of deep mud. Rocking it, not yanking it. Buster got there with his winch truck at 10:15 a.m. The winch was mounted on a heavy equipment transporter, a big Kenworth day cab with a 20-ton lowboy behind it, the winch on the rear of the truck frame. He set up 200 feet back from the Challenger, on the firm ground at the field edge, ran his line out, and rigged a snatch block on the front of my machine to double the mechanical advantage. That gave us an effective pull of 160,000 pounds if we needed it. We'd see. The plan for attempt number 2 was this. Buster's winch pulling steady from the front at about 60,000 pounds, Greg's 9620RX on a second chain attached to the rear left track frame, Dale's quad track on the rear right. All 3 forces applied simultaneously, with Greg and Dale angled slightly outward to help roll the machine side to side while Buster pulled forward. Ken's 8400 was parked on the approach road with his phone out, calling if anything looked wrong from a distance. The coordination required for this is not nothing. 3 operators, 3 machines, 1 stuck tractor, and the goal is to apply enough force to break a seal while not breaking the machine you're trying to save. Dale and Greg have farmed alongside me for over 20 years. We don't need a lot of words on something like this. I stood at the edge of the safe zone, far enough back that if anything let go, I'd be out of the kill zone, and gave the signal with my hand. The 3 machines took up their slack simultaneously. The chains came tight in order. Buster's winch line first, then Greg's chain, then Dale's. The Challenger's tracks, which I'd been running intermittently to help break the suction from inside, began turning again. The mud around the front frame began to move. Not much, just at the corners, a slight heaving, the substrate giving back a fraction of an inch. The machine rocked left. I could see it from where I was standing. Just a few inches, a slight shift of the rear track frames in the mud, but movement is everything in a situation like this. Movement means the seal is imperfect. Movement means there's a geometry that can be exploited. Greg feathered his throttle. I saw the exhaust change on his 9620RX, that characteristic pulse of a big diesel being loaded and unloaded in rapid succession, and the Challenger rocked back right. Dale answered with pressure on his chain. Left again. The mud at the front corners was churning now, not because anything was moving much, but because water and air were finally getting in under the frame edges where the suction had been absolute for 4 hours. I could see bubbles. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Bubbles meant the seal was breaking. Bubbles meant atmosphere was reaching the underside of that frame, where for 11 hours, nothing had reached it but 67,000 pounds of machine and the weight of Missouri clay. I said, not to anyone in particular, loud enough to hear myself, "Come on." Then right again, as Greg and Dale alternated pressure on their respective chains. And then, at 11:47 a.m., after 4 hours and 5 minutes in that hole, the front frame came up. Not all at once. Like a door being opened slowly against resistance. 2 inches. 4. Then the suction broke with a sound like a bathtub draining, a long sucking pull from underneath, and the front of the Challenger rose 8 inches in about 2 seconds, and the whole machine began to move toward Buster's winch line. It took another 22 minutes to get it fully out, because the rear tracks were still buried, and we had to keep the pull steady and controlled to avoid bogging the recovery machines. But the worst was over the moment that front frame came up. The tracks found purchase, the machine's own power added to the pull, and at 12:09 p.m. the Challenger rolled up onto firm ground, and I walked up to it and put my hand on the rear track frame, and it was still warm from the engine heat. 67,000 pounds of machine, 11 hours, 3 additional tractors, 1 pipeline winch, more chain than I want to price out right now, plus 1 length that became scrap metal. I let the engine run for 30 minutes before I moved it, just to let the systems normalize after being tilted and buried for that long. Walked around it twice, checking for damage. Some mud in places mud shouldn't be. A hydraulic line fitting that had worked loose on the front lift. Nothing structural, nothing that wasn't field fixable. That machine is built for this country in a way that still amazes me every time it does what it just did and walks away. The northeast corner of that field sat fallow for the rest of the week. I planted it last, after everything else was in and the ground had another 4 days to firm up. Came out of it 194 bushels per acre at harvest, which is above my farm average. The ground doesn't hold grudges, neither do I. But I do hold lessons. And the lesson from that day comes down to this. Know your ground, know it in wet years and dry years. Know the old river channels that don't show on any map. Know where the water wants to go when it can't go down fast enough. That knowledge is what determines whether a bad situation becomes an expensive half-day or something much worse. We got the machine out. We all went home safe. That's the measure of a good day in farming, even when it doesn't feel like one at the time. If this got your blood up, subscribe. Tell me in the comments about the worst stuck you've ever pulled. See you in the field.